Hello, my name is Jennifer Roberts, and the title of my presentation is I Can't Breathe, the Many Sides of Environmental Racism. This presentation is one of many that comes from the Socio-Environmental Research Group. We are a group of scientists dedicated to studying the joint contribution of social and environmental factors in relation to health disparities, health inequity, as well as resilience. We have designed these presentations, which we're also calling primers, for researchers looking to cross-train in social and environmental sciences. For this presentation, there are three main learning objectives. Before we can really understand the many sides of environmental racism, we need to examine the origins. In so doing, we will answer the question of what is scientific racism? Second, we will look at modern racism and its relationship with health inequity. Finally, we will end by defining environmental racism and hopefully obtaining an understanding in context to these other forms of racism. So my presentation is divided into three parts, and all three are threaded through the theme of racism and its influence in health inequities as related to built social and natural environments within the United States. I plan to exemplify this theme by providing a historical discussion of the 1918 influenza pandemic and surrounding events, as well as the COVID syndemic of today. So the first part is a historical examination of scientific racism. The second part focuses on issues related to modern racism. And then the third part takes a look at environmental racism in context of what has been discussed. I want to make note that even though I'm highlighting the African-American experience and the African-American consciousness, many of the same or similar issues that I will be discussing are applicable to other historically marginalized populations. So what is scientific racism? We can see self-interested justification for the atrocities of African bodies going as far back as the 1400s. Here I show three examples of how this form of racism propagated over the years. To begin with, we have William Petty, who was an English scientist, philosopher, and economist who rose to prominence during the mid-17th century. While he was considered progressive for his groundbreaking economic theories, he was also responsible for some of the earliest work of scientific racism. He insisted that the various races were not just distinguished by physical traits, but also in their, quote, natural manners and in the internal qualities of their minds, unquote. In his manuscript, The Scale of Creatures, Petty maintained that all living things created by God were part of a hierarchical pyramid, with Caucasians at the top and lesser creatures such as worms and Guinea Negroes at the bottom. Next, we have David Hume. He was a Scottish philosopher and a social theorist who influenced the development of skepticism as well as the experimental science of human nature. He's notorious for dividing the human species into two in his Of National Characters essay. And he stated that, this is a quote, "I am apt to suspect the Negroes to be naturally inferior to the whites. There never was a civilized nation of any other complexion than white," unquote. Finally, we have Georges Cuvier, who was a French nationalist as well as a zoologist, and he conducted several racial studies, which provided part of the foundation of scientific racism. He's most known for his autopsy of Sarah Baartman. She was a woman from South Africa who was brought to Europe to be a servant, as well as exhibited as a freak show attraction by the English surgeon by the name of William Dunlop. And this was in the 19th century. And when George Cuvier did this dissection of Sarah, he was stating that never had he seen a human head more resembling a monkey's. And he also likened her to being like an orangutan. So as this scientific racism prevailed in this newly formed United States, a preoccupation with Blackness continued to emerge out of skin and skull studies related to the construction of race. By identifying the so-called tangible traits unique to Black bodies, physicians could legitimize their discussions of racial difference with this physiological proof. And this pathologizing of Blackness kind of provided a tool to separate, to oppress, and to exert power over Black bodies. And so this construction of racial difference, as well as the medicalization of Blackness, they were mutually dependent forces and essential to the development of medical knowledge that we have in America. But it also became critical for the justification of slavery, particularly as we approach the Civil War. So if we fast forward past the Civil War to the Reconstruction period, we had an end of slavery, but despite this end of slavery, the declaration that African Americans were US citizens and had the right to vote, this whole Reconstruction period was really sabotaged and a complete failure, because African Americans were still systematically impoverished, disenfranchised, and marginalized from mainstream American society. This was done through Black codes as well as a sharecropping system. Black codes were just pretty much restrictive laws designed to limit the freedom of African Americans, ensure their availability as a cheap labor force. And this, coupled with the sharecropping system, ultimately kept freed slaves in a perpetual state of poverty. So in addition to these economic constraints, there was this period where white supremacy was running even more rampant, and this reign of terror was maintained by groups like the Ku Klux Klan, which were also supported by state governments. And between 1882 and 1968, there were over 3,400 lynchings of African Americans, and most occurred in the southern states. So again, Black codes, as I had mentioned previously, and by other means, where these insidious new forms of forced labor emerged in the American South after the Civil War. So you had this convict leasing, which was a system of forced penal labor, and it was overwhelmingly involving African American men. So for example, through Black codes, there may have been a law stating that African Americans were not allowed to walk on railroad tracks during a certain time of day. Then if you were caught doing such, you would be convicted and sentenced to manual labor. And so you had this system where you had these crimes, which may not have even been crimes, but you were able to get this kind of free labor as a result of this convict leasing. And then there was peonage, or this debt servitude, which was the system in which employer just compelled the workers to pay off debt with work. And ultimately this resulted in an endless cycle of work without pay. So due to these poor economic conditions, as well as the terror of Jim Crow South, many African Americans started to flee the South. And this again started shortly after the Reconstruction period. And so this massive internal migration of African Americans is known as the Great Migration. And between 1915 and about 1970, there was an estimated 6 million African Americans that left the South, which is known as the first migration as well as the second migration. And during the first migration, predominantly African Americans were going to the Northeast as well as the Midwest. But in both migrations, the first and the second, there was a significant change in the share of African Americans in urban centers. So for example, in the first Great Migration, if you look at the city of Gary, Indiana, in 1910, 2% of the population was African American, but by 1940, it was 18%, which represented a 16% change in the share of African Americans in that city. And that was the largest change during the first migration. So while segregation was not necessarily legalized in the North as it was in the South, racism and prejudice were nonetheless widespread. A large portion of African Americans lived in cramped, dilapidated, and impoverished conditions in these urban areas, which were very different from the nature-filled rural areas of the South. But the housing was segregated through the use of racial covenants and other measures such as redlining. And even though the employment opportunities afforded an opportunity for higher pay, the working conditions were arduous and sometimes very dangerous. There were also racial tensions up north, and these racial tensions arose because you had these skilled African American migrants who were coming from the South, who were able to get hired for jobs, and then you had poor unskilled whites who were not, and so there was a tension coming from that. Then there were also additional tensions when thousands of servicemen returned home from fighting in Europe in World War I to see that their jobs had been filled in factories and warehouses and mills by these newly arrived African American migrants. So shortly after the first wave of the Great Migration picked up momentum, and in the midst of World War I, you have the 1918 influenza pandemic that broke out. There's no universal consensus regarding where the virus originated, but for decades, scientists have debated that it started either in France or China or even in the American Midwest. But what is definitely known is that there were three distinctive waves and arguably a fourth wave that was localized in the New York City area. What's also interesting is that historically the human curve, the influenza, has always been U-shaped with, infants being the vulnerable as well as the elderly being the vulnerable. So those are the two peaks. But with this particular outbreak, there was a W shape because you had the addition of a third peak of young adults. And while this pandemic was worldwide, very little of it was actually mentioned because of the wartime censorship. However, Spain, which was a neutral territory, they were actually the first to report this because when their king was ill, he had a 3-day fever, they put it in the newspaper, and hence you hear the name the Spanish flu. So even before the pandemic, African Americans were already living in very deplorable conditions. And this was recognized by the prominent sociologist and civil rights activist W.E.B. Du Bois in his Philadelphia Negro Social Study. He clearly articulated that the health disparities that were observed among African Americans, which include higher rates of TB, pneumonia, diarrheal disease, they reflected the social conditions and not racial susceptibilities, which had already been an ideology that had been propagated through the scientific racism. And so the impact of the 1918 pandemic just exacerbated these disparities as well as inequities. This was particularly evident in a lack of medical care that African Americans received either before, during, as well as after the pandemic. And then the racism and the discrimination was even more palpable as African Americans were starting to be blamed for the spread of the disease. So they were being blamed because they were coming from the South. So people were saying they were bringing the influenza. And you can even see in this comic right here, which is printed in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, that during this time you can see the level of racism with the image of a white person infirmed in the bed saying that the contagion was spread by their African-American washerwoman, their butler, their delivery boy, their cook, their maid, their driver. And then finally this piece on the floor, it states that there was a denied application for city care, which stated that no place for Negro contagious diseases. We only care for white germs. But interesting, during this period, during the second wave of this pandemic, African Americans actually had lower rates of morbidity and mortality. They did have higher case fatality rates in comparison to whites, but they did have lower morbidity and mortality rates. So then with this growing tension surrounding the Great Migration, the financial insecurity, the sickness and the death of the pandemic, the racial and ethnic prejudice, all of this came to a head in the summer of 1919. Many Northerners did not want African Americans to migrate up north. They did not want them to come from south. They thought they were bringing these migration problems. And if you were found to entice African Americans to come up north, you could actually be penalized. And while the summer of 1919 was signified by one key event, specifically this event, which happened in July 1919, a young teenage boy by the name of Eugene Williams, he was swimming in Lake Michigan, and he drowned after violating an unofficial segregation line because he was subsequently stoned to death and he drowned as a result. And this kind of was the signifying event of this summer, but even still, there were riots and murders of African Americans in cities that happened well before July and April. And these riots and these lynchings and these mobs erupted across the United States. The three most violent areas were Chicago, Washington, D.C., as well as Elaine, Arkansas. And then even after the summer, there were still these tensions that continued to grow because people were saying the migration problems from the South were coming up north. So here's a visualization of some of the lynchings, the massacres, the riots, and just the annihilation of Black bodies that were occurring throughout the summer and throughout the nation. And here I have a map that shows pretty much the distribution of the riots, the major riots and the lynchings of the Red Summer. It's not exhaustive because, for example, there were events that happened in New York State, but this just kind of gives you kind of a display, a geographic display of some of the major riots and lynchings that occurred. So now let's pivot and take a look at where we are now, over 100 years later. One of the issues that we face today is how to explain and position the race disparities and equities that we see in the context of racism. Modern racism, they neither express nor endorse racist views and stereotypes, and they believe that racial equality pretty much has been achieved and that we don't need any further discussion. We don't need any more policies to promote equality or equity, which therein lies the problem. So since last April, the news media has been filled with headlines that revealed the startling race and ethnic-based disparities of COVID-19 cases as well as deaths. I'm going to show you two graphs. This first one is from the beginning of the pandemic to this past December of last year. We see there was at a point where the US age-adjusted COVID mortality rates for all folks of color, with the exception of Asians, was 2 to 3 times higher compared to white individuals. Then we see with this next graph, which was from December of last year to March of this year, we see that the gap has closed a little bit, but actually the mortality rate has actually increased for Pacific Islanders. Some of the other communities of color have actually decreased their mortality rates just a little, but even still, folks of color were at least twice as likely to have died from COVID than white Americans. And then, unfortunately, the COVID data by race and ethnicity seemed to dry up last March, partly because states were no longer releasing these data to tracking projects and perhaps for many other reasons. But there is some current data that is provided from the Kaiser Family Foundation. And we can see, here's an example of Washington, D.C. This is an example looking at data that's most very current as August 2nd of 2021. And using this Washington, D.C. data, we can look at the alarming disparities that we see. So compared to their population proportion of only about 46%, Black residents make up over 70% of COVID-19 deaths, and their vaccination rates are not meeting demand for their mortality rate as well. So in order to really kind of take a look at this, I like to use Dr. Melody Goodman's phrase, your zip code is a better predictor of your health than your genetic code, to address health disparities and inequities. And a way to understand this phrase is to look at all of our determinants of health. So if we should use COVID-19 as an example, we can kind of walk through this. When we're born with a set of individual health determinants, whether that's our genetic predisposition, our generational influences. All of these things influence our health behaviors as well as our health outcomes. Health behaviors like what we eat, which subsequently affect our health outcomes like maybe obesity or diabetes, which can then in turn affect our health behaviors again. As such, we have seen in this pandemic that certain health outcomes or pre-existing illnesses puts us at a higher risk for severe illness from COVID-19. But that's not the whole story. We have these social determinants of health that actually exemplify Dr. Goodman's expression. Everything from the built environment, such as the type of house or the neighborhood we live in, to the food environment, so the availability of healthy foods, grocery stores versus corner stores in our community, to the social environment, so the social and cultural systems that we all navigate, whether it's in our home, our work, just everything throughout our life. All of these affect our health. And then finally, All of these environmental silos are put into motion by the laws, the regulations, the policies, many of which are stemmed from racist and discriminatory ideologies. So let's take a look at our built natural environments, particularly during the pandemic. In July of 2020, the CDC listed visiting parks and recreation facilities, particularly parks close to your home, as a way to protect yourself and others from COVID-19. However, almost half of Americans don't have a park within a 10-minute walk. And this statistic varies significantly by state, income, race, and ethnicity. And we have known, or we have seen, that the quality of parks is highly correlated with neighborhood demographics. Parks that serve a majority of people of color are typically half as big and serve nearly 5 times as many people per acre. So we saw that there were constraints during the pandemic where crowds ultimately became crowded because you had floods of people going there during the heightened period of quarantine. So we do know that nature is beneficial to health and well-being. But when folks don't have an equitable access to these nature spaces, then there will also be inequitable health outcomes. And we've seen that more people of color are living in areas where there are nature deprived or nature gaps. So similar to 100 years ago, this past summer, which is kind of calling the racial reckoning summer of 2020, there was an implosion of tensions surrounding this issue with Black body brutality, similar to how Eugene Williams' murder at the Lake Michigan beach was the signature or the final straw of the Red Summer of 1919. We saw the same thing last summer with the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And so I've actually identified some parallels between past summer and the Red Summer of 1919. You can see that there was definitely racial violence. There was international uprising, slightly different, but there was massive demonstrations in multiple pandemics, one with influenza versus with the coronavirus. And then there was economic insecurity. And so you see that it's a little bit of history repeating itself. So now let's see how this all is related to environmental racism. This Washington Post article was published about 4 months ago, and I think it's really a perfect way to illustrate what environmental racism is. It discussed the derivation of the term environmental racism during the North Carolina protests in the early 1980s. So what had happened was we had Ben Chavis, who was a civil rights leader and activist, and he coined the term environmental racism in 1982. This occurred during a PCB landfill protest within a predominantly African-American community in Warren County, North Carolina. And while the disposal of this carcinogen PCB laced soil ostensibly provides the meaning to environmental racism in this particular situation, racism in other forms were also revealed during this weeks-long protest. So for example, Ben Chavis, he stated that he was a marked man because he was the leader of this revolt. And he said when he was on his way to bail out some protesters who had been arrested, he was stopped by a state trooper for driving too slow. And then he was subsequently arrested and thrown in jail. And he expressed this level of racism. He stated, this is racism, this is environmental racism. But what's really interesting here is that he made this statement in the context of his work with the PCB protests. But him being pulled over while driving as a Black man in the South encompasses so many other forms of environmental racism. And so we have also Dr. Robert Bullard, the father of environmental justice, who's defined environmental racism as any policy, practice, or directive that differentially affects or disadvantages, either intended or unintended, individuals, groups, or communities based on race. And I tend to agree with this definition as it encompasses so much more than the issues of like toxicants or toxins in our water or air or other media. And I probably would add one more piece to this definition and say communities based on race, particularly at the intersection of race and poverty. So to wrap this up, I'm going to ask a question for you to think about. Dr. Deborah Robinson, who is presently a faculty member with the School of International Training, years ago, she wrote a piece called Environmental Racism, Old Wine in a New Bottle. And in that piece, she stated, environmental racism, therefore, is a new manifestation of historical racial oppression. It is merely an old wine in a new bottle. And so my question in light of what I have discussed in this presentation is, do you agree? Thank you for your attention, and I hope you have enjoyed this presentation.